The phone rang at 2:47 in the morning. Muhammad Ali picked it up on the second ring. He had not been sleeping. He rarely slept those days. And the voice on the other end of the line said 4 words that would change everything. "Tonight is the night." Then the line went dead. Ali sat there in the dark of his Louisville home, holding the receiver long after the dial tone started. And he made a decision right then and there. He would not run. He would not hide. He would not beg anyone for protection. Because Muhammad Ali had already decided, months earlier, that there were things in this world worth dying for. And he had already done the hardest thing a man can do. He had said no to the United States government. What he didn't know yet was just how many people wanted him dead for it. To understand what happened on that terrifying night, you have to go back to April 28, 1967. That was the day Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, the most famous athlete on the planet, walked into the Armed Forces Examining and Entrance Station in Houston, Texas, and refused induction into the U.S. military. When his name was called, he didn't move. They called it again. He stood perfectly still, with his arms at his sides, chin up, eyes forward, like a man who had already made peace with whatever was coming. The officer in charge informed Ali that refusal was a felony, that he could face 5 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine. Ali didn't flinch. He had already written out a statement, which he handed over quietly, the paper slightly creased from being folded in his jacket pocket all morning. It read, "I have searched my conscience, and I find I cannot be true to my belief in my religion by accepting such a call." By the time Ali walked out of that building into the Houston heat, the world had already turned against him. Within hours, the New York State Athletic Commission suspended his boxing license. Within days, every other state athletic commission in America followed suit. His passport was confiscated by federal authorities. He could not fight professionally. He could not travel internationally. He could not earn a living doing the one thing he had devoted every waking hour of his life to since he was a 12-year-old boy in Louisville who had his bicycle stolen and decided he wanted to learn how to fight. At 25 years old, Muhammad Ali, the man who had shocked the world by knocking out Sonny Liston, who had danced and jabbed and redefined what a heavyweight could be, was stripped of everything. The newspapers called him a coward. Politicians called him a disgrace and a traitor. Retired generals went on television to condemn him. Letters poured into his manager's office by the thousands, and not the kind anyone wants to receive. Some were just slurs, pages and pages of them, written in shaking and furious handwriting, mailed from towns all across America. Some were explicit threats, describing exactly what the writers planned to do to him. Some included photographs. His manager's office received phone calls so deeply disturbing that the staff stopped answering the main line entirely and forwarded everything through an intermediary. But there was one specific group that the FBI had begun watching more carefully than the rest. In the files that were eventually declassified over the following decades, buried deep beneath layers of bureaucratic redaction and careful government language, there is a section that the vast majority of people have never read, and most historians have barely touched. It describes a network of men, some of them veterans, some of them highly organized, some of them connected to groups that the Bureau had officially classified as extremist, who had specifically and deliberately identified Muhammad Ali as a target. Not merely a symbol to protest in the streets, not a figure to criticize in the newspapers, a target, a specific human being they intended to eliminate. These men believed, with complete and total sincerity, that Ali's refusal to serve his country was not merely unpatriotic, but an act of treason deserving a traitor's punishment. And in their worldview, they were the ones appointed to deliver it. The FBI formally opened a threat file in the summer of 1967. It grew with alarming speed. Ali was fully aware that he was being monitored. He knew the phones were tapped. It was almost too obvious to bother hiding. He knew that certain vehicles parked outside his home stayed too long to be coincidental. He had been told, in quiet conversations by people who understood how these things worked, that the danger surrounding him was genuine and escalating. His trainer, a man who had spent his entire adult life around hard people and had an instinct for when a situation had crossed from uncomfortable into truly dangerous, sat down with Ali one evening and told him plainly, "Champ, these people are not playing games with you. This is real." Ali's response was to go on tour, unable to fight professionally, unable to travel outside the country, banned from every arena that mattered to his career. Ali did the only thing that remained available to him. He spoke. He traveled to college campuses packed with students who were wrestling with their own draft notices. He stood in churches and community centers and auditoriums. He addressed crowds of thousands in that voice that could fill any space without amplification. That particular Louisville cadence that could take a single sentence and make it sound like something between a sermon and the challenge. He would stand at the podium and say, "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights?" The crowds erupted, but so did the threats. Every time Ali appeared publicly and spoke, the volume of correspondence arriving at his manager's office spiked sharply. FBI agents noted in their internal files that certain individuals had begun systematically tracking his public speaking schedule. One bureau report from late 1967 stated, with the precise and bloodless language of government bureaucracy, that the subject's public appearances represented periods of significantly elevated personal risk. The agents writing those words were not wrong. It was during this period, deep in the autumn of 1967, when the threatening communications began to take on a different and far more disturbing character. They were no longer vague. They were specific. Not just generalized threats, but concrete details, specific venues, specific cities, specific times of arrival. Someone had done serious research. Someone knew Ali's schedule well enough to name the exact building in the exact city where he would be speaking and the approximate hour he would walk through the doors. These calls came to different phone numbers: his home line, his manager's business office, the home of a relative 2 states away. Whoever was making them had access to information that should not have been easy to obtain. That meant planning. That meant patience. That meant this was not impulsive. The night of the anonymous call, the 4 words, "Tonight is the night." Ali was home alone. His wife had taken their young daughter to stay with family earlier that day. Whether that was simple coincidence, or whether someone close to Ali had received a private warning and acted on it quietly without alarming him, he never said directly. But he was alone in the house, and the phone had woken him from a half-sleep on the couch. And after the line went dead, he sat in the complete darkness and did not turn on a single light. What happened next was painstakingly reconstructed over many years from several independent sources. A retired FBI agent who gave a long and candid recorded interview in the final year of his life. Specific sections of the Bureau's files that were eventually released through Freedom of Information requests, and the detailed account of a man who identified himself only as Marcus, who contacted an investigative journalist in 1994 and claimed to have been directly involved in the planning of what was supposed to happen that night, but could not go through with it when the moment came. According to these accounts, there were 3 men. They had driven from another state, crossing state lines deliberately to complicate any potential federal investigation. They had a specific and carefully developed operational plan. They were not disorganized amateurs acting on impulse. At least 2 of the 3 had formal military training and backgrounds, which gave their planning a methodical quality that random criminal violence rarely possesses. Earlier in the evening, they had driven slowly past Ali's street twice, at different times, observing the lights in the windows, counting the cars parked outside, noting whether any surveillance was visible, checking whether anyone appeared to be watching the house from outside. What those three men did not know, what almost nobody outside an extremely small and trusted inner circle knew, was that Ali had already been warned. Not through any official law enforcement channel, not by the FBI, whose institutional interest in that period ran far more toward monitoring Ali and building a case against him than toward keeping him alive. The warning had come from inside the network of men who were planning the attack. One of the men who attended those planning meetings, who had sat around a table and watched the maps being laid out and the schedule being discussed, had a son. That son was 16 years old. He had grown up at his father's house, absorbing his father's beliefs and his father's hatreds, like a child absorbs everything in his environment, by total immersion, without being given a choice. But that same boy had also grown up watching Muhammad Ali fight. He had a poster on the wall of his bedroom, put there years before any of this politics meant anything to him. Put there simply because Muhammad Ali was the most electric and extraordinary human being he had ever seen move across a television screen. He had spent entire afternoons in the backyard shadowboxing, pretending he had those hands, pretending he had that speed, pretending he was floating like that across a canvas floor with 70,000 people on their feet. When that boy, 16 years old, still living in his father's house, still eating his father's food, when that boy pieced together from overheard conversations and a document left carelessly on the kitchen table what his father was planning to do, and when and where, something broke open inside him that no amount of ideology could seal back shut. He sat with it for 2 days. He barely ate. He could not sleep. He kept looking at the poster on his wall. And then he found a payphone 3 miles from his house, fed in his coins, and dialed a number he had found through a contact associated with people who handled security at Ali's public events. He told the man who answered everything he knew, the date, the address, the approximate time. He said he was not sure if it was tonight or a later night, but he thought it might be tonight. Then he hung up the phone, walked home in the dark, went upstairs to his room, and sat on the edge of his bed, looking at the poster until the sun came up. That phone call reached Ali's inner circle within 40 minutes. A decision was made, not to call the police, not to move Ali to another location, but to be ready on the street. Because when the circle told Ali what was coming, he refused to leave. He had been sitting in the dark already. He had heard the words on the phone, and he told the man standing in his living room something that the man repeated to other people for the rest of his life. If I run from this tonight, then everything I have said means nothing at all. I told this country and this world that I am not afraid to die for what I believe is right. I meant every single word. So they did not move him. Instead, word went out quietly through the neighborhood, through the community, to people who knew Ali, who had watched him speak, who understood what he was standing for and what had been taken from him. The message was simple. Something might happen tonight on this street, and we are not going to let it happen alone. The 3 men arrived in the early hours of the morning. One stayed behind the wheel of the car with the engine running. 2 got out and walked toward the house along the front path. They had made it most of the way up the walkway when every porch light on the block came on simultaneously. Not just Ali's house, but 3, 4, 5 neighboring houses all at once, flooding the quiet street with yellow light in the middle of the night. And then the 2 men on the walkway stopped walking because they realized they were not alone. There were people on that street. Not law enforcement, not federal agents in unmarked vehicles, neighbors, members of the community who had received the quiet message and had made their own decision to be present. Some were standing on their front porches with their arms folded, looking directly at the 2 men frozen on the walkway. Some were standing at the edge of their driveways. One woman was seated calmly on her front steps, with a child asleep in her arms. And she looked at those two men with an expression that contained not a single trace of fear. Marcus, speaking to that journalist nearly 3 decades after that night, described what it felt like to be standing on that walkway with his partner in that moment. He said, "We had planned for one man alone in a dark house. What we found instead was an entire community that had decided together that this was not going to happen on their street, to their neighbor, on their watch. There was nothing to do." The two men looked at each other, looked at the street, looked at the faces, turned around and walked back to the car, drove away and never returned. Muhammad Ali never spoke about that night in any public setting, not in a single interview across the next 50 years. Not in any of the thousands of speeches and public appearances he made after his conviction was unanimously overturned by the Supreme Court in 1971, and after the boxing commissions began restoring his license, and after he came back to beat Joe Frazier and knock out George Foreman and silence everyone who had spent years telling the world he was finished. He carried that night privately, the way survivors carry the things they did not give up on, the things they refused to let define them by running. But the 16-year-old boy who had made the call from the payphone, who was a man in his 50s by the time Marcus's account became public knowledge, was eventually located by a researcher who had spent years carefully following the threads. His name has never been published, at his explicit and repeated request. When the researcher asked him why he did it, why he made that call, knowing what it might mean for his relationship with his father, knowing what it might mean for his own safety, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There isn't a complicated answer. He was Muhammad Ali. He was telling the truth, and you don't let the truth get killed in the dark." In June of 1971, the Supreme Court ruled 8-0 in Ali's favor, vacating his conviction on the grounds that the Justice Department had never properly specified which legal basis his draft board had used in rejecting his conscientious objector claim. His titles were eventually restored. His passport was returned. He came back to the ring and did things nobody had any right to expect of a man who had been forcibly idle for the peak years of his career. He fought Frazier. He went to Kinshasa and knocked out George Foreman in the 8th round in the dark African morning air. He won the heavyweight championship of the world for the 3rd time. And then, in Atlanta, in 1996, he walked out onto an Olympic stage with his left hand trembling visibly from the Parkinson's disease that had taken his body but had not touched his presence, had not reduced by a single degree the thing that made 70,000 people in that stadium go completely and totally silent, and then erupt when they saw him lift the torch. None of that happens if 3 men on a walkway don't look at a neighborhood that refused to disappear into the dark. None of it happens if a teenager with a poster on his bedroom wall doesn't decide that what he knew and what he felt were more important than the house he lived in. None of it happens if Muhammad Ali doesn't sit alone without turning on a single light and decide that a man who runs from the things he has said out loud in front of the whole world has already lost something that no boxing commission can ever give back. History fills its books with Muhammad Ali inside the ropes, the shuffle, the jab, the rope-a-dope, the poetry he recited before fights, the predictions that came true. Those things deserve every word written about them. But the real contest, the one that cost him more than any punch landed by any man who ever stood across from him, was fought outside every ring that ever existed, during the years when his government took his livelihood and the threats against his life were real, and the darkness outside his windows was not a metaphor for anything. He didn't simply refuse to go to war. He stood in the center of a country that had decided to crush him for the refusal, and he did not move, and he did not stop speaking. And on the night that 3 men came to his street to end the voice that would not go quiet, his community stood in the light for him. That is the full measure of who Muhammad Ali was, not only the greatest fighter, who ever lived. The man who understood that the greatest fights are the ones nobody watches. And he won those too. If this story reached something in you, if you believe the world needs to remember not just what Muhammad Ali did inside the ropes, but what he faced and refused to surrender outside of them, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell me in the comments, what do you believe takes more courage? Stepping into a boxing ring with the hardest puncher alive, or standing completely still in the dark when the entire country is telling you to run? I want to hear what you think, because Muhammad Ali already answered that question, and his answer changed the world. And if you are watching this and you have never heard this part of the Ali story before,